A troubled child runs away from home and finds himself in a mysterious land where he becomes the king of monsters. Welcome back to Recap Spot. Today we'll be recapping the 2009 fantasy film Where the Wild Things Are. The film opens on Max, a rambunctious young boy, as he chases his dog through the house while wearing a wolf suit. Max eventually catches up to his dog, and the two energetically play around while Max yells. We then see Max outside working on building an igloo. Once it's finished, he yells at his sister Claire through the window to try and get her to come look at his creation, but she's busy talking to a friend on the phone and tells him to go away.
I made it!
Max is upset at getting ignored by his sister and heads back to his igloo to make a makeshift flag. He then starts using his imagination and playing around with the flag. Eventually, he sees his sister Claire and some of her friends, and he starts a snowball fight with them. Max has fun playing with everyone at first, but Max gets upset when one of Claire's friends destroys his igloo. Instead of consoling her brother, Claire just gets into a car and leaves to go hang out with her friends. Enraged, Max storms into Claire's room and begins to destroy it. He gets snow everywhere, throws her things around, and even breaks a present he made for her. After destroying the present, Max holds the broken pieces and feels guilty. He gets into bed with a small toy boat and pretends that it's sailing across the ocean. His mom finds him in bed when she gets home and can tell that he's upset. He tells her about the igloo incident and she consoles him.
I'm sorry.
He shows her what he did to Claire's room and she helps him clean up the mess. Later that night, Max walks in on his mom while she's working and on the phone talking about her struggles with work. Max tries to help cheer his mom up by acting goofy around her, and he's able to get a few laughs out of her. She then asks him for a story and begins typing while he makes up a crazy story for her. At school the next day, Max is playing with a toy in class, while his science teacher talks about how one day the sun will die. At home that night, Max makes a fortress with his stuffed animals and asks his mom to come up and see it, but she tells him that she's busy. Max is irritated and puts on his wolf suit before stomping downstairs and seeing his mom kiss her boyfriend. His mom gets ready to serve dinner and calls Claire down to move her things off the table. Max starts being obnoxious and disobeying his mom as she asks him to do things, eventually climbing up on the counter and yelling at his mom that he'll eat her.
Max, get off the counter. Get off.
The two argue and fight until Max bites his mom and hurts her. Conflicted with feelings of guilt and anger, Max runs out of the house. His mom tries to chase him down, but she loses him when he runs into a forest. After finally calming down, Max travels through the forest and finds a boat floating in an ocean. He sails off and eventually falls asleep, awakening to find an island off in the distance. He sails through a storm, but is eventually able to make it to the island. Once ashore, Max travels through the island and he eventually finds some monstrous creatures known as wild things. Carol, one of the wild things, is angry because a wild thing named KW has left.
She left. Exactly.
And so he is destroying the homes of the other wild things. Max jumps in and starts destroying the homes with a stick as well. The wild things are confused, but Carol eventually says that he likes the way Max destroys things. Carol has Max help him destroy stuff, but the other wild things get mad at him for destroying their homes. They're suspicious of him and begin to threaten to eat him. Max is able to stop them by saying he's a Viking king with strong magical powers from another land.
You can't eat me.
A wild thing named Judith questions Max's lie, but eventually the creatures believe him and decide that he should be their king too. Suddenly, KW shows back up and is introduced to Max. Now fully accepted as king, Carol gives Max a scepter and a crown to wear. They ask him for his first order as king, and he commands for the Wild Rumpus to start. Max and the wild things all begin to dance, scream, and fool around throughout the forest. Carol eventually gives Max information on who all of the wild things are. He starts with Judith and Ira, who are in love with each other. He then introduces Alexander and Douglas. Carol gets distracted messing with Douglas, leaving Max to meet Ira. Max and the wild things all start goofing around, while a lonely wild thing, just called the Bull, wanders around by himself. Max finds Carol watching KW, and Carol says that he hopes she's back for good.
What you doing?
Max plays with KW and tackles her, encouraging all of the wild things to form a pile. Max and KW talk in the pile, and he asks her if she's going to stick around. She also tells him about her friends Bob and Terry, who are very different from all of the wild things. She then asks about Max's family, and he gets upset talking about them. Max and the wild things all fall asleep in the pile, and when Max wakes up, he's being carried by Carol, who says he wants to show Max his kingdom. They walk all throughout the island, and eventually Carol brings Max to a structure in a desert with a model in it that depicts what Carol wished the island looked like. Max is blown away by the model, and he tells Carol that they should make it a reality. Max says they need to start by building the perfect fort.
We could totally build a place like that.
And eventually the other Wild Things wander over to help build the fortress. Max puts Carol in charge of building the fort, and everyone comes together to help gather materials. While building, Carol carves an M with a heart around it into the fortress, and Max hugs him. After seeing this, Judith calls Max over and asks if he likes to play favorites. Max says he likes all of them equally, but Judith doesn't believe him. The two get into an argument, and Judith gets mad at him for being upset with her. KW intervenes and breaks up the fight. She walks into the forest with Max and tells him not to worry about Judith. She decides to bring him to meet her friends Bob and Terry, who turn out to be two owls. Max is weirded out, but KW tells him to ask them for advice. Max asks them how he can make everyone okay, and they squawk out an answer. KW understands what they're saying, but Max can only hear squawks. KW wants Bob and Terry to live in the fortress with them.
Bob, Terry, why don't you come live with us?
So she and Max bring them to the other Wild Things. When they arrive back at the fortress, the Wild Things are all excited to meet Bob and Terry, except for Carol. Carol is rude to them and ends up making everyone else mad. Carol storms off, and Max follows after him to figure out what's going on. It's obvious that Carol is jealous of Bob and Terry because he loves KW, and Max helps console him, and Carol asks him if there's anything he can do to fix things. Max gathers everyone and decides the best way for them to all have fun together is to have a dirt ball fight.
Okay, we're gonna have a war.
He sorts the Wild Things into two teams, the good guys and the bad guys. Everyone is having lots of fun at first. However, things turn sour when Alexander gets hurt and angry, saying that he doesn't want to play anymore. Everyone else keeps playing until KW steps on Carol's head and the two get into a fight. Max is upset that everyone isn't happy, and KW tells him that she's going to leave again, and she doesn't know why she came back. That night, Judith confronts Max because he's the king and should be able to keep them all from fighting constantly. Carol defends Max and says that he'll be able to bring back KW because he has magical powers. Carol asks Max to show them his powers. Max stands up but isn't able to do anything, causing everyone to lose faith in him and wander off. Max sleeps by himself that night, and the next day he treks through the island by himself. He makes his way to the fortress, where he finds Alexander sitting alone. Alexander figures out that Max was lying about being a king, and is actually just a regular person. Alexander says he doesn't care about that, but tells Max not to let Carol find out.
Just don't ever let Carol find out.
That night, Max is sleeping with the Wild Things, and hears Carol talking in his sleep about how he wants to eat Max for not helping them. Scared for his life, Max spends the next day trying to make a small room that only he could fit into. That way he'll be able to hide from Carol. Carol asks him about what he's doing, and gets mad when Max says he wants to make a small room just for himself. Carol decides that Max is changing things, and KW is gone, so he decides they need to tear down the fortress. Max tries to stop him and starts to get into a fight with Carol, when Douglas steps in and says Max isn't their king, he's just a boy. Carol fights Douglas and ends up ripping off one of his arms. Max tells Carol he's out of control, and Carol threatens to eat him.
You're out of control!
He starts chasing Max through the forest, but Max eventually runs into KW, who offers to hide Max in her mouth. Carol finds KW and asks where Max is, but she won't tell him because she's scared he'll eat Max. Carol says he wasn't really going to do that, before crying and asking if he's as bad as Max says he is. Carol eventually leaves, and Max tells KW that Carol doesn't mean to be the way he is. Max comes out of his hiding spot and tells KW that he's going to go back home. The next day, Max goes looking for Carol and eventually finds him with Douglas. Max tells Carol the truth about just being normal, which makes Carol sad.
So what are you?
We then see all of the Wild Things, except for Carol, getting Max's boat ready and preparing to say goodbye. The bull comes up to Max and asks him if he'll say nice things about them to his family, and Max says that he will. While everyone is saying goodbye to Max, Carol is in the fortress, where he sees a C with a heart around it, made out of sticks. Realizing that Max must have made it, Carol is overcome with emotions and runs to say goodbye to him before he leaves. Carol makes it to the beach just as Max is sailing out, and the two tearfully howl at each other. Eventually, all of the other Wild Things join in. Max returns to the forest and runs home, where he embraces his mother and eats with her at the table. Click one of the videos on screen right now.